You ever just eat a mushroom that you find on the ground and then it just sends you on the worst trip?
Yeah, one time back at Midsummer, I had a really weird experience.
Yeah, me and my friends, we always called it mushroom roulette.
Yeah, and then...
You might die, you might have a good time, who knows?
You might die, you might drown your baby in a swamp. There's all kinds of things you can do. We're the pod people. I'm Matisse Fenrossum, and I'm scared and confused, and I just want to leave the forest.
Hi guys, I'm... Cleveland Mosier. I'm Cleveland Mosier. Sorry, there's just a... What is that noise? I keep hearing.
What is going on from?
Yeah, I don't know. Anyway, how's it going?
I'm the German snack boy, Ben Sheets.
Interesting.
Guys, it's episode 69.
Nice.
All I gotta say about that? Nice. And for episode 69, Cleveland, we talked about your pick, Hagazussa.
We did. We did do that. I'll start by saying last podcast, I mentioned this film and saying that I saw about 20 seconds of the trailer and thought that the aesthetic alone was enough to draw me in and want to take a sort of a wild card movie. And
yeah, sure.
I was under the impression from the 20 seconds of imagery that I saw that it was, originally I thought it was like tribal, like Scandinavian, and I was quite wrong. It's actually Plague era Germany.
Have you ever seen The Witch and been like, hey, this movie's moving too fast. I can't keep up. I need it to slow down. Well, we have a movie for you.
Yes.
If you've ever thought that, then Hagazussa might be the right film for you. Mm-hmm. As you mentioned, Cleveland, it is a German film from 2017 directed by Lucas Fiegelfeld.
What a name. 10 out of 10.
Right. Starring Alexandra Quen, Claudia Martini, and Tanya Petrovsky. It's about a young goat herd in 15th century Germany who is overcome by madness and superstition. As a plot synopsis, that is pretty generous.
Yep, that's the film.
Yep.
Like that's it. That's what you're going to get going in.
Well, and coming out, too.
And coming out. Yeah, that is true.
When you picked this film, I Googled it just to see the country of origin, just because I'm like, Hagazussa is probably not not Scandinavian. An English language film. But I didn't watch the trailer. I was just like, okay, this looks interesting. Cleveland wanted to pick it. Cool. I did see some stuff that it was considered Germany's answer to The Witch. Like, I went into it with pretty high hopes.
Yeah, that is definitely I could say a detriment. It's not doing it any favors by comparing it to The Witch.
It's not a particularly fair comparison.
No, it's inherently like it's made with good intent, like to compare it to such like an incredible film.
It's a similar time period with similar mood and witch.
Yeah,
that's it.
I would say it's apt in terms of atmosphere and
period piece horror.
Right. But outside of that,
there's very little in common. Hagazussa is a old High German word meaning witch.
So it's literally the witch in German.
Yeah. I did see, after we watched this film, I did a little bit of research on it just because it's very obscure, I guess.
Yeah, I would say abstract in a lot of ways.
I saw
every way.
Really. I saw that this film was actually a student film, Lucas Fiegelfeld's senior thesis film for film school.
Again, why I think witch comparisons are just unfair.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense because in many ways it feels like a student film.
Yes.
In that it's made by somebody who has some degree of knowledge of film history and film canon and has love and respect for certain films and directors and has a sort of vague idea of concepts that they want to explore.
Well, it's certainly ambitious and high budgeted for a student film.
And I will say, well, it is kickstarted. We saw in the credits that it was partially crowdfunded. And I believe I saw that he also received a grant from his school.
That would definitely help as well.
To help with the budget. It is extremely ambitious, and for the problems that I have with this film, I'm very comfortable saying that it's a far more impressive feat than my own senior thesis film.
I wish that I had known the information that I had going into this film was that it was an ambitious student film and not a witch comparative. I feel like I might be a little bit more generous, have been more generous, with the movie.
I mean, I don't know, man.
I think
using
the we have on
student
them are all
film
valid
as an
and the same.
excuse is not the most apt, because I've seen really good student films, like
well.
Martin Scorsese's The Big Shave is one of the greatest short films of all time, in my opinion, and that was a student film, I can understand it being a bit of a crutch, but I don't want to emphasize that as any excuse.
I'm not gonna lean on that in my own critique of it.
I do want to start with one of the two elements that I think is the strongest, the cinematography. I thought the cinematography in this film was often quite
beautiful,
stunning.
Yeah.
I think they shot on Aries. I don't know if it was film or digital. It looked digital.
I would guess digital.
It's the
for a
framing...
student film in 2017, like even crowdfunded, I think film would be a little bit too expensive.
Yes, yes. The framing of the movie is very very art house, very mood piece.
Yes,
but the budget does not reflect that in the same way. Like we're not seeing a lot of like weird shaky cam and like any grain in the shots. Like it's all crystal clear, looks great, well mic'd.
It's very sharp. It's also very contemplative in its pace, and a lot of the shots are very long. It's very picturesque. In that way, I would relate it to The Witch. In a lot of the cinematography feels very painterly. The Witch does use exclusively natural light, and it's obvious that this film
does
didn't.
not. Yeah.
So I think there's a little bit lost there. But again, I don't want to compare this too much to The Witch. But the cinematography is very sharp.
Absolutely.
I think it's a very good looking film.
I want to separate too the look from sequences, because I do have a few more problems with the sequences themselves.
Sure.
But the look of the film is very, very nice. While I don't always think the shots justify their 3-minute times, there's such long, protracted shots in this film sometimes feel justified, most of the time, in my opinion, don't really. I want to emphasize that I like slow cinema, stuff like Tarkovsky or Bellatar, where you have these long, protracted shots and sequences, but there's very contemplative and there's something to grasp onto, to think about during those sequences.
Right.
Yes. The problem I have with this film is I feel like there's not enough to grasp onto, so you're thinking about things during those sequences.
There's not very much happening. It's certainly more of a mood piece than a narrative film, I think. It has the simplest, barest narrative possible, and I understand the appeal of that, but I still, like you said, Ben, you still need to give people things to contemplate.
Yes.
And there's not a whole lot of that in this. I would consider the film more of just like a series of tableaus, kind of, than like a real story, because there are events that happen in the film, but they are pretty much unmotivated.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing too, like the thing that works so well in The Witch and movies of its ilk are, I think of Antichrist as a good comparative for this film, because it's very slow and contemplative in a lot of times,
and about
in
an
the
hour
same way.
longer.
Yeah, but the thing is, with both of those movies, they use those slow contemplative shots to build a sense of tension and dread. And because we don't have enough to grasp onto in this film narratively, that isn't really built. So by the time things escalate in the third act, it kind of just flickers out rather than feeling like
a climax,
a hard-hitting conclusion.
Yeah.
You know, it feels like this film was almost the prelude to like a very long, like 6+ hour thing, you know, like at the pace it was going.
That
it
was like building up to a film's inciting incident.
Yeah.
And to be clear, too, like the wackiest part about that, and I fully agree, is that the events that occur during the climax are hard hitting. They are like intense,
pretty grotesque,
and grotesque, and it has all of that, but. The film does it's eroded by.
There's so little connectivity that I felt somewhat distant from the events that happened at the end. It's like I had just been sort of like meandering through the woods the entire movie, that when this stuff happens, I didn't feel attached to it.
Right, and that one could make the excuse that is because the character herself is very illusory and very distant, but I don't think that's a justification.
Well, she's also mentally ill.
Yes.
Which is a big theme of the film. That was one of the things that I read that I wanted to bring up, that I don't know if I necessarily would have got just from watching the film. The writer-director said that the film is supposed to be an exploration of what it would be like to have a debilitating mental illness in the Middle Ages, when there is no concept of that kind of thing, and that superstition would lead others and the person who is mentally ill themselves to think of like witchcraft.
Yes.
Well, and the thing is, part of the reason that doesn't translate very well in the film is because the style of the film is so detached from the perspective of her.
Totally.
Where
we are so outside in as a viewer.
You're looking outside in for sure. You don't get that subjectivity of something like Repulsion or something where you're feeling like you're understanding the insanity of the character.
Absolutely. I agree completely. There is such a distance to it, and I think that concept is really interesting, and it does bring some added context to certain scenes that I think adds points. But it's like, man, I shouldn't have to read about that from the director after watching the film. Like, I should be able to get that in watching the film, because throughout the film you kind of just feel like she is just becoming a witch, or that she is under some sort of supernatural attack.
Or that it's an allegory for the plague. Or that it's
an allegory for the plague.
Which is, the biggest thing I got
So it's like, there's not really much of a suggestion that, like, oh man, this is, a mentally ill woman who doesn't have any help and is secluded, and like the toll that takes on her. But the problem is that there's very little interaction with the outside world, so there's not any sort of like sounding point for normalcy to sort of compare what is happening with her, with Albrun.
Right, and in such a foreign time environment,
right,
to like, I think it is pretty important to have that comparative. I
mean, you don't really get a degradation in her state either, really. You kind of get it, but it's so distant and abstract.
It's a very gentle slope. Yeah, like, it's not much of an escalation.
It's not really noticeable.
No, I mean, we see her at the beginning of the film, like, as a child living with her mother, and it's in the winter, and we see the one scene of, like, people from the town coming to their house at night with torches and being like, we're gonna get you witches or whatever. So they establish that there's, like, a separation of these people from the town, and then her mother dies of the plague and leaves her alone, and then it cuts to her as an adult, but it's like, you can kind of get that there's something there just from, like, the seclusion and, like, the rest of the town labeling them as witches, but, like, once she's an adult, it's kind of a plateau of insanity or whatever.
Yeah.
That then, at the very end, has a spike because of a bad trip from eating mushrooms in the woods. It's just such a straight line. Whereas The Witch has such a dramatic escalation that takes its time, that's very slow, but that by the time you get the climax of the parents trying to kill Thomasin and then her killing her mother and the father being killed by Black Phillip, and like that all feels like an earned climax that has like built up.
I mean, do you like the taste of butter has just become like one of my all-time favorite lines in cinema.
Like to live deliciously.
It's so good. And again, it's unfair to the film, but it does need to keep coming up because it is such a comparative point. I actually have two films that I wanted to bring up for that same reason when talking about the pacing of this film and how it is a mood piece if there ever was, just to kind of like further hone in on like what Ben was talking about. It's two films that we've talked about on the podcast, and that's The Golden Egg and Herzog's Nosferatu. The Golden Egg only because it also features a lot of ponderous shots, and I remember defending it.
The Vanishing. The book is called
The Golden Egg, right? With the film The Vanishing. Thank you. And that film has a lot of ponderous shots, and I remember defending it a little bit and saying like I really like to sit in a film.
Well, in that case, there's once again. There's stakes.
Yes,
there's something to hold on to.
There's things happening.
To contemplate.
Yeah, and I think like and I wanted to bring that up too to better defend like y'all's positions on the movie and like the substance and the effect of that. Like when you have those quote pensive sequences, where we're looking at these mountain ranges and there's just this drawn out music playing. And sort of hypnotic and sort of designed to place you in like a sort of a transient state. But because we're kind of cutting back and forth between the character and that, and there's not enough substance going on with the character, we're just sort of left there, sort of empty, looking at these mountains.
Yeah.
Well, I think that there's still something that can be said for that. I'm a simple man, and I like just looking at mountains to beautiful music. I do agree. I do think that like that isn't necessarily enough. And also like I want to make clear too, I don't see you guys as coming to it from the perspective of like a Westerner looking at a European film and going like, oh, it's slow moving, so it's boring, and there isn't clear exposition. It's like that's definitely not where y'all are coming from.
No.
I recognize that.
I'm not the type of person to be like, film boring because nothing happened. I like slow and contemplative too. I think to your point that just like long drawn out shots of nature or like dark moody things with like music is enough. I think that in certain settings it can be. Why I would consider this film a series of tableaus rather than a narrative film is that if it was something like a video installation piece where you were in like a gallery and you were, walking around and could sit with these shots and sequences and experience the music. I think as a prompter for like eliciting a type of mood or atmosphere, it's really good.
Yes.
But the benefit of that setting is that when you've had enough of one, you can just move on.
I think that's a really excellent point.
I'm glad you brought up a gallery comparative because I wanted to bring that up with your prior point about how you had to look up information on the film afterwards to sort of draw what its core like themes and messages were to like abstract like modern art in galleries and my personal opinion on like the use of an art card on the wall.
Right.
And I feel like if you have to read the art card on the wall, the description like of the painting next to the painting to understand
then it's
the painting, then it can be. It can make a point that the piece itself did not convey what it was trying to and then needed outside assistance. I do not believe that's always the case. I think that there are plenty of great abstract pieces that are just nice to ponder over and can have multiple interpretations.
Sure.
But it is a way I like to judge that sort of thing, and I think that applies.
I don't want to open that bag of worms too much because that's a whole rabbit hole.
We've done multiple times.
I think you have a really good point that in a gallery setting this would work much better because it is a very non-narrative piece in some ways where it is focused on mood and atmosphere. So if you experience bits and pieces of it, you would be okay. The problem I have is with it structurally as a feature film.
Exactly.
Because I think slow cinema is much like novels to me in a lot of ways. especially like Russian literature like Tolstoy or Dostoevsky, you don't have a ton always going on, but you have a lot to think about when there's not a ton of action going on.
Exactly.
You know, you have stuff to keep you there to at least think about themes or ideas that they're presenting, even if it's not narrative action.
And also that you can put a book down. Like when you feel like you've had enough at that moment, you can set it down and say, all right, that gives me stuff to think about. I'm going to come back to it later. What I kept finding myself in this movie is that like a lot of the sequences, I'm like, cool, I like this. Nothing's really happening, but I like it. And then at a certain point, I'm like, all right, let's move on, please. Mm-hmm. And then it goes for like another 10 minutes.
Yeah.
And liking them individually, but wanting to be able to move on, it just made me feel like I was in like a gallery setting where I can do that. I can get what I need from each and move on. And I'm not really missing anything because there's not a whole lot happening.
Well, definitely. And I think that's a really good point, because it's one thing if I feel like it's saying something or it's going at a theme or idea. I really can't say what the idea of this film is, you know, at a thematic element. Yeah. And I'm not a proponent of thinking that way for all films, but like especially for these minimal films, like give me an idea to think about, give me a theme, you know, like I don't really know what this movie was trying to say.
Well, yeah, I do now after being told what it's supposed to say.
Yeah, but it didn't convey it.
Exactly. That being said, I can look back at instances in the movie with that context and be like, oh, okay, yeah, I get it. And it gives me maybe a little bit more of an appreciation for those things, but it still comes back to I was not getting that from just watching the film.
Which rolls it back to the art card thing. You know, like that's I think as a mood piece, you don't really need the art card, but for the narrative aspect and the ideas aspect and the, you know, what they're trying to say aspect of it, you would need that additional info.
Which is why I think that this director would do quite well directing someone else's script.
I mean, I'm certainly intrigued enough by this movie.
I would definitely like to see more of their work.
More of this guy's films, because I think that he has good ideas and he has good practices. There's just something missing.
One thing
or just learning from this film. I mean, student work.
One thing I thought of near the end of this film is I wonder if it was originally supposed to be a short film, and because of Kickstarter and Grant's success, extended it out to a feature.
I think it would be a better short.
I think it would be a much better.
I agree.
I think there's entire sequences that you could cut out and whittle the whole thing down.
And the thing is, you could keep the majority of stuff in it. You would just have to pace it better, and I think that would be for the benefit of the film overall.
I would say two thoughts on that. First off, I agree. This film, I think, could have been more generally successful, like as a short film, or it could have just succeeded in what it was trying to do. My personal preference would be just to give the film more content. And I have a couple of like theoretical solutions, primarily being, as we said before, like we're stuck outside looking in at our protagonist.
Yeah.
Sure, like sympathy means like I suffer with you, but we never feel like we are. We feel like we are watching someone suffer, because the place where the film misses the mark is just after she has grown up. Like when we cut to the adult Albrun.
We have zero connection with Albrun whatsoever.
None. We have none. I like the mystery behind her baby. I thought that was fine. I thought that was great.
Sure.
But we have no cause to like her. We don't get a sequence of joy with her or anything else with her before the sorrow, it is all sorrow.
The problem is that there's so little connection to her, partially because there's very little dialogue in this film, and I'm fine with...
it could have been done without dialogue.
I'm fine with largely dialogueless films, but there needs to be something that connects us to this character, and the only time we see her as a child is for the opening sequence, which is largely just the death of her mother.
Yes.
Extended very long. But
which I personally liked that. Like, I liked how extended that was. It was just that the film continued to be after. I like a slow start. I like coming into a movie, breathing into it, but then I need something.
There's elements of that I liked. That's one of the few times in the movie where I felt tension because you saw the mother degrading.
Yeah.
There was a build there.
And I thought a lot of that was pretty successful.
And we get a sense that we're seeing that sequence through the eyes of a child, like the way that she's perceiving like the witchy elements of the mother could just be like her imagination. There's a magical realism element to it. And I thought that was great.
In all likelihood, her mother is also mentally ill, and it's a genetic thing. And that's probably why they're outcasts and separate from the village, and why the villagers think that they're witches. That really comes out in her mother when she's dying. And then, it starts manifesting in her when she's an adult. But there's just that huge gap in time that we know nothing about. None of that is really suggested all that well without the context of the director being like, here's what I'm trying to convey. And I think that the part with her mother dying is one of the, like you said, Ben, more tense scenes and spookier, especially like when she tells Albrun to like get in bed with her and she's like sniffing her. That's really
deeply unsettling.
And then when Albrun runs off into like her room and we just hear her mother in the other room just like screaming and, runs out into the woods, into the snow. And then even Albrun finding her in the swamp with the snakes on her body. Like that's all really cool. It's just like nothing ever really comes of it all, Yeah.
I recognize that this is a dark, brooding, foreboding time in history, in a culture that is largely like stereotyped as dark, brooding, and foreboding. Like I present Herzog as an example, but even then, any moments of joy, even if they're fleeting, would have helped me better empathize with our protagonist. Like, and I want to bring up a comparative. I hate to do it again. All the children in The Witch have moments of joy. They're fleeting, but like playing peekaboo, the baby is taken off immediately after, but the kids like doing their sing-song bit, which becomes very creepy. The boy trying to do what's right. The characters are made whole. They're made to be dynamic, but like through that, and just seeing any joy in them, any humanity. And two, like when you have such a mentally charged person, they can have like pretty charged moments of joy before flying into whatever else.
It's not even just joy either. It's just that first scene where we really are introduced to Thomasin as a character when she's praying and asking forgiveness for her sins, which in that time are much more weighty, than what we would consider now just like normal things. And it's like she's impeaching God for forgiveness for things that don't need forgiving. And it's like that is immediately something to connect with that makes this person seem human and sympathetic. And then to follow that up, with her playing peekaboo with the baby, which is then taken and then she's blamed for. It's like you feel like you understand this character and you feel bad for her, what's happening. And like you said, the little boy, the little brother, like trying to do what's right and also being concerned about like the fate of his mortal soul, even though he's an innocent child.
All things that make us invested.
Right. And there's nothing like that in this movie.
No.
There's never a moment of like Albrun craving acceptance or anything.
And she doesn't even do that. Like she might not just want acceptance, but like just like having a moment where she sees something in nature that is sweet, that fills her with joy. No dialogue is even required for what I'm asking. Like it can be done with mood. Like
sure.
It can like just to give us like anything. Her initial display is her going into the village being harassed and her tending to her child without all that joy.
With very little tenderness.
Yeah, and which is fine again, like considering like her mental state, but the very unusual like sexual encounter with the goat as well.
Yeah, which I want to talk about because that scene was directly ripped off from Viridiana, the film I have a poster of over there by Buñuel. It was straight up pulled directly from it, 100%. And that's not the only sequences that was directly ripped off in this movie. The sequence where she puts her hair in the water and pulls it up and kind of has it over her face was directly ripped off from Tarkovsky's Mirror.
Film student shit. Real film student shit.
So I don't mind, directly pulling from inspirations.
Paying homage is great.
But, with the film with so little going on, it's a little more egregious.
Well, see, okay.
That is not good. Yeah.
I do want to talk about a little bit about the scene where she masturbates while milking the goat. I think that has potential to really add some interesting depth to it that really doesn't pay off because, like you said, there is the mystery of her child. When it cuts to her as an adult, she has an infant. There's nothing about a father. Swinda even, asks her at one point and she says, there's no man. So the
film, makes it relatively clear that it was likely marauders of some kind and that she was,
Yes, but there's also the implication that because she is perceived as a witch,
that she had a child with
the devil.
Yeah, with the devil.
The devil. Because she is a goat herder.
That it's a bestial child.
It's right. There's no man, there's no father. And we have the scene where she gets off while milking this goat. So there's a sexual connection with the beast, most commonly associated with devil worship, I liked it that there's that implication and there's no payoff.
Right, and I even thought the execution, well, up until Ben said that it seemed to be so immediately pulled from this other film. I felt like the execution was quite good, and
I've seen some Buñuel, but I haven't seen Viridiana, and I've seen a lot of Tarkovsky, and I haven't seen The Mirror, so those are both references.
Yeah, well, and I think the idea is interesting, like you said, but I think the approach to it is a little heavy-handed too.
Right. Well,
I think it's done better in Viridiana because it's a little more subtle, which is funny because the rest of this movie tries to be so subtle that having a scene that's so direct feels over the top, in my opinion, in comparison.
Well, that's the thing. When that scene happened, I'm like, okay, now we're gonna start getting into the spooky stuff. Now we're gonna see that maybe she is a witch and that that there's something there, and then there's not. Another scene that I really like is when she has the encounter with the priest at the ossuary, and he gives her mother's skull polished and painted. I thought that scene is very cool, especially visually.
Very Herzog.
It's very cool.
Reminded me of Nosferatu.
Old Germanic. You know? But that scene also never really has any payoff. I thought there was going to be more about that because this priest is very sinister and he's talking about purging and stuff like that. When that scene happens and then that's followed up by the goat scene, it's you're getting this idea that oh man, the town is going to be riled up against her. Things are going to start happening in the town and she's going to be blamed for it, and it's going to be is she a witch? Is she not? And we never see the priest again. There's never any reference to that ever again. It just serves to get her mother's skull, which she sets up a little altar to.
And it never feels like these moments are deeply affecting her.
No, she's so stoic.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I think that approach can be done. One great example of that is the film John Dielman by Chantal Akerman, which I would not recommend to everyone. It's 4 hours long. It's very repetitive. But essentially what it is it's a housewife doing chores for 3 hours of the movie. And it's very minimal, contemplative, and slow. But you can tell these things are affecting her and how she's doing them. And while they're very repetitive, I think the repetition works to its advantage to make it more contemplative. I think...
And there's a kind of madness in repetition,
yeah, and I think this kind of approach could work if they had, more approaches to show how this is affecting her.
You can't have a descent into madness if you're already in the basin.
And
if you're already in the depths, then you can't continue to plunge.
And once again, because it's so distant, having a static character, you can't understand them in the same way because you're not getting the element of how this is affecting them. And it doesn't even always have to be through their subjective view of how things are happening. You just need to be able to see, like, visually in their face how things are affecting them. And because she's so stoic, you get so little from that.
I will, like, in defense of the actress, I think a lot of it's just because her being underutilized.
I think it's. I think the problem is in the direction, not in the actress.
Yeah,
because I did want to make one point about her, like, Malcolm McDowell Clockwork Orange-esque, like, wide-eyed gazes that she does.
I mean, she has straight up bug-eyed stare in the swamp scene near the end.
There were a couple
but that was
of times,
one of the few times where, like...
That's my thing, is that when she is directed to emote, she does it well, but it seems like the director only had two modes for her, which is completely stoic, unresponsive, and eye-popping insane. Like, those are her two modes. So much of the film is just her. It's so isolated, but we have no connection to her if we don't get any idea of how events are affecting her.
Right. And it's what happens when you keep your cards too close to your chest.
Yeah.
And the thing is, I think even having stoic characters doesn't have to detract from that. You know, I think of directors like Robert Bresson, who intentionally made sure all of his actors didn't really emote at all in his films. But the thing is, they had things to grasp in terms of idea, and substance.
They're not emoting, but there's substance under it, so the lack of emotion provides a different context for the substance. But in this case, there's no substance and there's no emotion. There's nothing. There's nothing other than
Give
mood.
me one or the other or both. But if you leave me with very little to nothing of either, it just leaves me empty.
Yeah,
you know.
Another really good example of something that didn't make me feel anything in this movie when I should have is her whole relationship with, like, the other village girl, Swinda, I don't think works at all. I found it very confusing because, like, this girl, like, reaches out to her and seems like she wants to kind of, like, make her less of a pariah and sort of, like, bring her in. She seems genuinely friendly, and then with
hard right turn,
zero motivation for the turn, leads her off to get raped by
who I guess is her husband, but we don't know. Some guy. Yeah.
And then neither of those characters are ever seen again. Ever.
We know what happens to them. We do see that.
Do we?
Yes, we do.
That's
what ends up happening is she's raped by them. She goes back to the place where she met them, drops the rat,
poisons the water.
She poisons the water by bringing a dead rat to it and pissing in it. And then we see the bring out your dead folks again. She goes to the scene of the crime to, like, see, like, the burial bodies, and then, like, goes back to her house. So, like,
those bodies aren't specifically Swinda and the rapist.
Yeah. Well, because they don't show the bodies, but I mean, it's well implied.
You know,
I think the implication is more than enough there. She goes back, she poisoned the bodies, and then the plague bringers just assumed that they died of the plague, and then they get cremated. I think that's
I'd
well
love to have a more direct payoff. You know, like,
well, I think the payoff was fine. Or I think the execution of the payoff was fine. I think that there just wasn't any substance before it. Like you were saying, like, we don't get anything with Swinda to make us feel anything with that.
It makes me, the whole thing made me feel nothing. Usually when filmmakers include, like, rape, it's supposed to be, like, horrifying, you know, and it's not.
It's like it's unsettling, and
it's unsettling at best, and completely unmotivated at worst, and serves very little narrative purpose, if any. Violence is one thing, but, like, if you're gonna have rape in your movie, like, that needs to serve a purpose, because that's not the kind of thing you should put unmotivated into your film.
Also, like, the killing of her goat, was it them? I don't know.
I mean, yeah, you can assume that it was people from the town because, like, she's bad, but we don't see these people. We don't see them being like, this bitch is a witch, we need to drive her out, we need to do something.
Like, there's some children mocking her at the beginning when she goes into town, and that's it.
Right, she gets bullied by children.
Yeah.
I think this movie has so many implied things that I would just, honestly, I think it would have been super appreciated to have some directness at times.
Yes.
To counterbalance
100%.
that. Just having things implied throughout your film, it doesn't make it contemplative. It just makes it vague. Having direct cause and effect or direct outcomes or direct things happening on screen doesn't make, it obvious,
right.
or less abstract.
100%. No, I completely agree. And just because of all of this, like when we finally get to the climax where she has a horrible mushroom trip and drowns her baby in the swamp where she found her mother's body, and then takes the baby back to her hut and cooks it and eats it, that is, from a visual standpoint, pretty powerful and striking and horrifying. But once again, I have no connection to it.
It just left me empty, honestly.
Yeah.
And for such a powerful scene like that, such an upsetting, disturbing scene.
And even the execution of it is
the
full
execution
marks.
is I think disturbing, because we see part of the baby's skeleton on her plate and she's chewing fat off of it.
Yeah,
And
it's so
gross.
well done.
It's
the execution's amazing.
If there was some sort of emotional impact behind it, I think that scene would have been truly horrifying.
Yeah, if I'd been made to feel anything for the character.
But because there's so much lack of substance otherwise, like you said, Ben, it feels completely empty.
It doesn't feel shocking because it feels like she could have done this at any point of the film.
I like our conversation we had right after the movie ended. Y'all were saying I felt like nothing happened in this movie, and my response was well, I mean, she did eat her baby, and then you just said well, yeah, but apropos of nothing.
Yeah. Seriously, that's also completely unmotivated.
It feels like a set piece,
and I think as a set piece, it works.
It's a very good, effective set piece.
It's an effective set piece, and I do like that kind of surreal part where after she drowns the baby and she goes underwater, the water kind of distorts and it looks like the inside of lungs or something, and there's blood, and it's very abstract and beautiful and creepy to look at.
It's gorgeous.
But once again,
stunning.
Why should I care about any of this? Why should I care? Why do I care? It looks cool, and it's got the score behind it, which is amazing. So it's great from a music video. Honestly, this whole movie should just be an extended music video for MMMD.
Which we should emphasize.
Yeah.
The music
Time
in
to
this
talk about
best
that.
part of the movie, for
the
sure.
Absolute best part.
The total highlight of this film.
Incredible, dark, tribal ambient.
I'm going to open the podcast with that piece, I think. So people listening will have already heard an example of the music.
Good.
It's awesome.
And I think that's one of the few saving graces of the film. I think if it had a lesser score, I don't know if I would be able to sit through all of this film.
The score does probably 60% of the mood work, and the visuals do the other 40. The music does so much heavy lifting, and it's mostly the same track and variations on the track extended. It's very minimal and repetitive, but it's just so dark and gooey. We watched a music video for that track that the duo did, and it's mostly just shots from this movie.
Expository shots.
And it works really well as a music video.
Yeah.
So it's honestly...
I love this genre of really old world, style instruments. And
I mean,
folky, dark ambient.
Yeah, dark
it's
folk is my jam and a half.
I would consider this, dark tribal ambient in a lot of ways, ritual ambient. It evokes that mood for sure.
Yeah, it's great. I agree with you, Ben. If this had a lesser score, I think I would have found sitting through this film much more frustrating because the music is just so good. I'm engaged in this just for the mood.
One point I want to make about the expository shots that kind of caught me off guard. As I said, there's a lot of shots of brooding mountains and forest and such, but there were two shots in the film I noticed where we saw forested mountains, but there were tracts through the forest that had clearly been brush cut with modern machinery. Could have been utilized as slaloms. And I also noticed another shot in the mountains where we saw a field in the mid-ground that looked modern manicured.
Also didn't see that.
And I was just thinking, I saw the shots and I was just you have all these other shots of mountains that don't have that in it. You could have gotten away with just not having those mountains.
They got away with it for me. I did not notice that at all.
It was a small thing for me.
Went way over my head. One thing I wanted to ask you, Cleve, is I know you mentioned this movie being sort of an allegory for the plague.
Yes.
Can you unpack that a little bit? Because I don't read that, but I'd be interested to hear your reading on it.
Most certainly. First off, we have just the fact that her mother succumbs to it at the beginning, and such a great deal of emphasis from the opening on is placed on the plague. We get these really gratuitous shots of like what would you call them, like the pustules like under the mother's arms. The makeup is too well done on, like it's really gruesome.
Those are called buboes. That's where the term bubonic plague comes from. They're swollen lymph nodes that are infected with plague bacteria.
And they are very well executed. They're nicely done. And we see this like played up with the mother, and later on when she goes to visit the priest. And we see the plague bearers and the people carting the bodies, bring out your dead. I feel happy. I think I could go for a walk, which we were all giggling over. So it's regularly established there. Also, we have a sequence. It's the only turning element that we get with Swinda between her being friendly with Albrun and her becoming her rapist. And that is, there's a sequence of the two of them sitting, looking over the mountains. She brings up Albrun's potential, her child's parentage, and that, she refers to, because we all had a big yikes over it.
The Jews and the heathens.
Yeah, and roaming marauders, and how
keeping them out of the mountains. She says something like, we have it so nice up here in our mountains, away from all the Jews and the heathens.
Mm-hmm. And she makes it clear that she feels some sort of, at the time we believe to be sympathy or sorrow towards Albrun with her child. I think she makes enough of a hint that that's probably where her child, where she's assuming her child is from. And of course Albrun says nothing. Later we see that it's disgust that she has for her over that. I was looking over I want to just better familiarize myself with the time and with the plague, which I've done a bit of reading on, how it affected Renaissance era Italy, but I was less familiar with how it affected Eastern Europe. I do have one quote here just off the Wikipedia page, which is, because 14th century healers were at a loss to explain the cause, Europeans turned to astrological forces, earthquakes, and the poisoning of wells by Jews as possible reasons for the plague's emergence. The governments of Europe had no apparent response to the crisis because no one knew its cause or how it spread. Renewed religious fervor and fanaticism bloomed in the wake of the Black Death. Some Europeans targeted various groups such as Jews, friars, foreigners, beggars, pilgrims, lepers, and Romani, thinking they were to blame for the crisis. And we see that sort of comparatively brought up with Swinda, saying the Jews coming through the mountains, these marauders.
Sure, that the townspeople would maybe consider Albrun as a source of the plague.
Yes, and thereby witchcraft as well.
Yeah, sure.
I thought that was interesting. That seems like directly pulled.
I think that's also interesting context. Once again, it rolls back around to that's the kind of thing that you can make a little bit more direct in your film.
Well, yeah, again, I had to read about it to make that comparative.
And that's my general blanket thought for most of this movie, is that in context, a lot of the stuff I think is
the subtlety
is interesting.
It works.
It's
just that's all there is.
The problem is that you have to have the context, which should not be the case.
Well, yeah, put some of that context in your film. Yeah,
right. Yeah, it's a period piece. We're kind of going and expecting some of that context.
And I'm okay to have films that are open to interpretation or can have multiple readings, but give me something to grasp on for those readings. There's so little in that respect.
Lest we start going too terribly in circles, do y'all want to rate?
I had one last point I wanted to bring up,
okay.
And I've touched on it briefly, but I want to get a little bit deeper into it. It's a short topic, but going back to the influences I think that Herzog's Nosferatu had on this film, when it comes to using realism to depict magical realism, not necessarily incorporating any immediate visuals of the supernatural occurring to display the supernatural. For instance, the Phantom Castle in Nosferatu. We see ruins and then we see castle, but we don't see the castle becoming ruins or any special effects. We just see expository shot of ruins and then we see the interior of the castle. And there's nothing to play off of with that. And I think this film did a decent job of applying that same concept. It's a little different because we're seeing supernatural occurrences with the mother looks very witchy, like when she's dying, and we see like some of the sequences of her like having like a schizophrenic break at the end.
There's only, I think, one instance of the true supernatural in this, which is another problem I have with it, because it kind of undermines the film completely.
The final shot, right?
Well, yeah, is that she, after she eats her baby, she climbs up to the peak of the mountain and bursts into flame.
Yeah.
What is that supposed to be?
I don't know. It looks great.
It looks great, but is that supposed to imply that it wasn't just mental illness and that it was witchcraft?
Right, like, it kind of does, because like literally everything else in the film can be displayed as, we're seeing her schizophrenia from her perspective.
Mental illness,
like
and
the mother whispering to her, like you hearing like
her mother's voice from the skull.
Yeah, like schizophrenia 101. Like that's fine. And like even the vision of her mother, like she's taken psychedelic mushrooms, which we know like psychedelics have a particularly like negative effect on people with psychological issues. So that's great, but that's it.
Right, and then she bursts into flame,
applies
once
this.
again, apropos of nothing, at the very end, and it makes for a very striking final shot, but what is it trying to say within the context of the film? It seems off message with the rest of the film. So I don't know, man. My
final little point before we get into rating, so my rating doesn't come out of the blue, is for me, mood without anything to think about, just shots of mountains and scoring and events occurring is enough. I had a great time watching this movie.
Sure.
But that is and I recognize this is quite limited to myself, and I feel most people will not feel that way about it, and I think that you are more justified, like in that perspective. But I had a damn good time watching this movie front to back. I enjoyed the set pieces. I completely recognize and acknowledge those criticisms and, joined in on like the picking apart of it, because I agree with those things, and I think you're right, and those things would have made it a better film. But for what it is, I really liked it. I do still stand by like my personal enjoyment of the film. I know how I felt watching it, and that was delight, because I love that aesthetic deeply, and it captured the aesthetic incredibly well. Unfortunately, it did not capture the characterization, and I am left, like you guys, feeling a little bitter about that because of what it could have been if it had, because everything else was so well executed, that if those things had been there, this film would have been, God, so masterful, I think. And again, I would advise like keeping an eye out for the director, for anyone associated with this film. What it did do, it did in spades.
Why don't you just throw a rating on the end of that?
That was my last. That was absolutely my last. I'm gonna stick with a 4 out of 5. I think that if what was there had not been so phenomenal, I would have given it a low rating. And in many circumstances too, I feel I would feel more bitter about the fact that it was lacking so much characterization and in its ability to draw me in as a film. I'm just a sucker from the start for like those sorts of visuals. So I'm giving it a 4. I'm giving it a strong 4 even, but with the acknowledgement that is my rating, and that I don't think that's the average.
It's interesting because right after the film, I originally had set to rate this at 2.5. I think upon unpacking it, it's been more clear to me how empty this movie made me feel in a lot of ways. It's slow cinema without any directness to grasp onto. And like we've been emphasizing over and over again this episode, like there's a big difference between having open-endedness and implied things in your film and just being vague. The imagery in this film was strong, but the director didn't have a great grasp on what he was trying to say with it. The music is incredible, but music alone with a film that doesn't really have narrative development, tension, or character development just leaves me empty.
It becomes a visual album.
Yeah, and it leaves me bored, honestly. It doesn't have tension, and it just left me bored. I'm going to give it a 2 out of 5. Check it out for the music. A gallery setting would be a great idea for this film. like you mentioned, but as a film, I think it kind of fails.
I'm the middle ground between you guys on this one. I have acknowledged before on the podcast that I tend to be much more frustrated with films that I see great potential in, and I tend to be harsher on them because of that. And I think that this film was overflowing with potential and even executed certain things well, but as a whole was extremely underdeveloped and I think incredibly unsuccessful because of that. The film's damn lucky that the cinematography and the music are so on point. I'm definitely intrigued to see more from this filmmaker, but I think that he owes more than he can ever know to his cinematographer and to MMMD, who did the music, because holy shit, without those things, I might have hated this movie.
Yeah, 100%.
But because I liked those aspects of it so much, it saves it from being what I would consider a bad film. I'm gonna give it a 3 out of 5.
I think that's
between you guys.
Yeah, I think that's the right.
That's fair.
The right rating.
I will say, if this was a short film, I'd probably rate it a 4. If it was cut down
probably
to like a good 20-30 minutes, you know, I think the content would be enough
would be
to
powerful. Yeah, absolutely.
Or again, like if the character had been more substantial, it could have been fucking 5 for me. Like,
it works as a mood piece, and I think it works as a series of tableaus, but little else. I'm all here for fucking Hagazussa, the gallery piece, though. Hagazussa, the video installation, I would be very, very on board for. Well, that'll give us an average of 3 out of 5, which I think, considering our range of opinions on this, is about where it needs to be. I would say check it out with a disclaimer. Don't go into it looking for narrative or anything to really happen, but if you're like Cleveland and you get a lot out of just mood alone, then I think this movie has that in spades. But it is certainly no The Witch. Yeah, and on that note, I think it's probably time for a word from our sponsor, don't you think?
It is indeed. So last week we had a bit of a fiasco where we had
a snafu, you could say.
Two supporters sponsor the podcast, but no sponsor, so they both were they kind of redacted themselves. But this time around, I have good news. I went high into the hills and found another sponsor for us. This week, supporting the podcast, we have bonbons for bonobos. And it's, if you didn't know this, there's a horrible plague outbreak amongst bonobos right now. Sure is. I'm seeing it on the news headlines right now, and it's definitely not a bit. It's saying, yeah, the bubonic plague is back, but don't worry for yourselves. Not affecting people this time. It's affecting the specific sect of ape known as the bonobo. And so there's a company right now that is trying to remove the bubos from the bonobos by giving them bonbons and just like easing their losses by giving them these delightful treats. What is a bonbon again?
They're like little pastries.
Yeah, little sweets. That's right. Yeah, I knew that, but thank you. And so this company is giving pastries to these poor diseased. These poor diseased. Sorry, it says that in the copy. I'm just reading what they wrote and making them feel better.
All right.
Yep. Support now. Get bonbons for bonobos and get rid of those bubos. No more bubos for bonobos. Give them bonbons. Bing bong.
Yep.
Bye.
All right. Well, next week, it's that fucking time again. It's our 2-year anniversary, boys. Our 2nd birthday.
Hell yeah.
We've somehow been doing this podcast for 2 years now. Similarly to last year, we're going to be doing a powerful original versus remake 2-parter. But this year, we're going to be talking about the films that gave us our namesake. We're going to be talking about Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Both the 50s version and the 70s remake. So get hyped to hear the pod people talk about pod people. We're getting really meta here.
Oh, yeah.
I have a lot of thoughts about both films. I'm excited to watch them again. It's been a long time since I've seen the 50s one. I think the last time I saw it was in early high school, so I'm happy and excited to revisit
I saw both
it.
in college last time.
I'm well familiar with the social impact of those films and like the zeitgeist that it was picking apart at the time or playing off of. But actually, when I was a child, they had a cassette of it at the library, and my parents wouldn't let me get it because it was too scary for me at the time. So I've never actually seen either version.
All right, well, you're in for a double dose of excitement, and so are our listeners. So tune back next week for part 1 of our second birthday spectacular. We'll be talking about the 1950s version of Invasion of the Body Snatchers. And if you want to give us an early birthday present, then head on down to Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts and smash that motherfucking 5 stars.
Whack it. Give it a good slap.
Hit it so hard that the internet shakes. And while you're at it, leave us a few nice words and why you like the show. We really appreciate that. You can also follow us on Twitter at PodPeoplePod. Or on Letterboxd at letterboxd.com/podpeoplepod, where you will find the list of all of the films we've talked about on the show with our average ratings and links to those reviews, as well as browsing the hallowed halls of our golden pods, also available on Letterboxd. You can follow me on Twitter at Mr. Van Awesome.
I'm at Mr. Sheets.
I'm occasionally tweeting for Light Arc Studio as we continue our development of It Stares Back, our delightful early access game on Steam that is a horror RTS RPG with fun storytelling and very lore and heavy narrative.
Very moody, but I promise with more substance than Hagazussa.
Hey. But be the judge of it for yourself and come check it out. And of course, join our Discord, our development Discord as well, where you can see us working on the game in real time. And if you mention Pod People, if you're one of the first to mention Pod People on when you join in, I'll shoot you a copy of the game.
Hell yeah. If you want to learn more about that, you can visit our website at lightarcstudio.com or just Google It Stares Back. We got pretty good optics on that, so you shouldn't have any problem finding us.
Oh, yeah.
But stay tuned next week. Birth time. See ya.
It is time.